In the late autumn of 2011, in a two-car garage attached to a brick ranch house on a dead-end street in Ashtabula County, Ohio, a price tag was pinned to a workbench. The tag was a standard 3x5 index card, slightly yellowed, held in place by a single thumbtack, pressed into the edge of a thick maple top. Written in the looping, practiced cursive of a woman who had priced thousands of household effects, it said, "Workbench and all tools, $400. The man's son, Mark Peterson, who was 48 and sold enterprise software, thought it was a generous price for his father's old junk. Silas Blackwood, who was 72 and had been a cabinet maker for 53 of those years, knew it was the mistake of a lifetime. But not his. Let me tell you about the man who built that bench, because a workshop is never just a room. It is a biography written in sawdust and steel. His name was Arthur Peterson. He died at the age of 82, not in his shop, but in a sterile room at the Cleveland Clinic, 64 miles to the west, of a failing heart that had beaten a steady rhythm against the grain for over 6 decades. He was a quiet man, known for two things: the precision of his joinery and the stubborn silence he employed when confronted with foolishness. Arthur had built the workbench in the winter of 1958, the year he turned 29. He was not a professional woodworker then. He was a lineman for the illuminating company, a job that paid the bills but starved his hands. The top was 3 inches of hard maple, laminated from 16 separate boards he'd bought for $112 from a lumberyard in Paynesville that no longer exists. He paid for it in installments of $10 a week. It took him 3 months to save up. The final slab measured 8 feet long and 34 inches deep, weighing an estimated 420 pounds. He flattened it by hand, not with a router on a sled, the way a modern woodworker might. He flattened it with a Stanley No. 7 jointer plane, a tool he had inherited from his own father, a carpenter who died in the war. The process took him 41 hours, spread over 2 weeks. He would work for 3 hours, until his shoulders burned and his hands cramped, then stop. He would check for flat with a steel straight edge he'd paid $18 for, a fortune at the time, and make another pass, peeling off a translucent ribbon of wood no thicker than a page in a Bible. When he was done, the top was flat to within 0.003 of an inch over its entire length. A sheet of paper could not slide beneath the edge. This was the foundation, the bedrock on which every project for the next 53 years would be built up. The legs were 4x4 Douglas fir, joined to the aprons with mortise and tenon joints, so tight they had to be persuaded home with a 3-pound mallet and the sweat from his brow. He used no screws, no nails in the primary construction, only wood and glue and the geometric certainty of a well-cut joint. He installed 2 vises. On the front, a Record 52 1/2 quick-release vise he ordered from a catalog for $42.50. On the end, a massive pattern maker's vise with a 24-inch jaw, which he salvaged from a school workshop that was being demolished. He paid the foreman $5 and a bottle of whiskey for it. He spent a week disassembling it, cleaning a half-century of grime from its cast iron guts, oiling the screw, and painting the body a deep, industrial green. That vise alone, in 2011, was worth more than the $400 asking price for the entire shop. But the bench was just the beginning. Let me tell you about the tools, because they were not a collection. They were an accumulation. Ecology of Purpose built one piece at a time. On the wall behind the bench hung a set of 12 wood-handled chisels in a leather roll. They were marples, with blue-painted steel hoops on the ends of the boxwood handles. Arthur had bought them one at a time from a hardware store downtown, starting in 1961. Each time a project paid for itself, he would take the small profit, usually no more than $15 or $20, and walk the 6 blocks to the store. He'd stand before the glass case, considering a 1/4 inch to pare the shoulders of a tenon, a 3/4 inch for chopping mortises. It took him 4 years to assemble the full set. The handles were stained dark with the oil and sweat of his hands, a patina that cannot be faked. The edges were honed to a mirror finish. You could shave with them, though Arthur never would have. A tool had its purpose, and vanity was not one of them. Below the chisels was the plane till. It held 14 hand planes. Most were old Stanleys from the 1920s and 30s, the golden age of American toolmaking. A number 4 smoother, his most used plane, its toed and knob worn to the familiar shape of his grip. A number 5 jack plane for rough work. The number 7 jointer that had flattened the bench. But nestled among them were 3 modern planes that told a different story. They were from Lie-Nielsen Tool Works in Maine, makers of the finest hand tools in the world. A small block plane, a low-angle jack, and a bronze number 4 smoother. These were expensive tools. The smoother alone had cost him $325 in 1998. He had saved for it for a year, setting aside money from the small furniture commissions he took on after he retired from the power company. His wife, Mary, had questioned the expense. Arthur, who rarely explained himself, simply said, "Some men buy boats." These tools were his boat. They were his connection to a standard of quality that was vanishing from the world. And then there were the saws. Not Craftsman saws from Sears, but saws that spoke of a global search for perfection. There were 3 Japanese saws, or ryoba, with their fine teeth and pull-stroke action, hanging from wooden pegs. He had ordered them from a specialty supplier in California in the 1980s, long before they were common in American workshops. There was a set of American-made Diston hand saws from the 1940s, which he had meticulously filed and set himself, a skill that was all but lost. And in a felt-lined drawer, there was a single bad axe tenon saw, its back a thick spine of polished brass, its handle carved from pecan wood. He had ordered it in 2007. It cost $275 and had a 6-month waiting list. He was 78 years old, and he waited 6 months for a handsaw, because he knew that the time it took to acquire the right tool was nothing compared to the time it saved and the satisfaction it gave over a lifetime of use. This was the world that sat in the garage on that Saturday morning in October. It was a museum of a single man's devotion, a library of skills written in steel and wood, the total replacement cost of the premium tools. The Lie-Nielsen planes, the bad axe saw, the Japanese chisels he kept in a separate box, was easily over $5,000. To a collector of antique tools, the Stanley planes and the record vise could fetch another $2,000 or $3,000, maybe more. The bench itself, if you could find someone to build it with that level of care, would cost $4,000 at a minimum. The entire collection represented a capital investment of somewhere near $10,000 in modern dollars, and a lifetime of searching, saving, and caring. The estate sale company, a local outfit called Generations Past, had been in the house for a week. The woman in charge, a pleasant lady of 60 named Brenda, had expertly priced the depression glass, the sterling silver flatware, and the mid-century furniture. She knew her markets. A Lane cedar chest was tagged at $250. A set of 8 Fostoria water goblets, $120. She walked into the garage, a space that smelled of aged wood and cold oil, and saw none of the value her eyes were trained to see. She saw a cluttered, greasy workbench. She saw old, rusty-looking tools hanging on a pegboard. It was a man's space, and her expertise did not extend to it. She asked Mark, the son, what he thought. Mark Peterson had not entered his father's workshop in 20 years. He lived in Columbus, 150 miles south, in a new-built house in a subdivision where the lawns were chemically green and the garages held SUVs, not workshops. His hands touched a keyboard all day, not wood. He saw his father's sanctuary as a liability, a mess to be cleared so the house could be sold. Old junk, he said. Dad was always fiddling with this stuff. I don't think any of it is worth much. Brenda, trusting the son's assessment and her own lack of knowledge, made a business decision. The goal was to empty the house. She bundled it, workbench and all tools, $400. It was a price designed to move the lot to set fast to the first person who could haul it away. A quick, efficient solution to a problem. Now let me tell you about Silas Blackwood. Silas was 72 years old and had been working with wood since he was a boy of 19 in his uncle's cabinet shop in West Virginia. He was a man made of straight lines and right angles. His posture was erect, his gaze was level, and his words were spare. He had moved to Ohio in 1964 and opened his own shop, Blackwood and Sons. Though he had no sons, only a daughter who was a school teacher. The name was a nod to the future, to the idea that a craft should be a legacy. For 47 years, he had built custom furniture and cabinetry for the people of Lake and Ashtabula counties. He'd built kitchens, libraries, and boardroom tables. His work was not cheap, but it was perfect, and it was permanent. Silas did not advertise. His reputation was his advertisement. He drove a 15-year-old Ford F-150 with 240,000 miles on the odometer. He wore simple khaki work pants and blue shirts every day. He was a creature of habit and precision. He rose at 5 a.m., was in his shop by 6, and worked until 4 p.m. He read books about furniture design and tool making. He knew the history of every tool in his shop because, like Arthur Peterson, he had acquired them slowly, deliberately. His shop was larger than Arthur's, a 2,000 square foot pole barn behind his house, but it shared the same soul. It was a place of order, where every tool had a home and every surface was clean. Silas had known of Arthur Peterson. They were not friends. They had only spoken a handful of times at a local lumberyard or a hardware store. They were planets in the same small solar system of craftsmen, aware of each other's gravity, but never colliding. Silas had seen a cherry hive boy Arthur had built for a doctor in Madison. He'd examined the hand-cut dovetails, the perfectly fitted drawers, the delicate shell carving on the apron. He recognized the hand of a master. It was a quiet, shared language. When he saw Arthur's obituary in the Star Beacon, a small notice that mentioned his 42 years at the power company and his love of woodworking, Silas felt a pang of loss, not for a friend, but for the craft. Another set of skilled hands was gone. He saw the ad for the estate sale in the same paper. It was a block ad, listing furniture, household goods, and, at the bottom, full wood shop, many hand tools. Silas was not a vulture. He did not circle the dead looking for bargains, but he was a custodian of a dying art. He felt a responsibility to see where the tools of a fellow craftsman would end up. He hoped they would find a good home, a place where they would be used, not hung on a wall in a themed restaurant. So on that Saturday morning, he finished his coffee, put on his worn canvas jacket, and drove his old truck the 12 miles to the little brick house on the dead-end street. The sale started at 9 a.m. Silas arrived at 9:15. He disliked crowds and the competitive jostling of early bird bargain hunters. The street was already lined with cars. He parked at the end of the block and walked, his stride even and unhurried. He bypassed the house, where people were picking through lamps and dishes, and went straight to the garage. The overhead door was open, and a river of people flowed in and out. Silas stepped inside, and the air changed. The scent of cut grass and gasoline from the lawnmower in the corner mingled with the sweeter, deeper scent of cherry wood shavings and boiled linseed oil. It smelled like home. He saw the bench immediately. It was the center of the room, an altar to a forgotten god. A crowd of men, mostly in their 40s and 50s, were gathered around it. They were hobbyists, weekend woodworkers. They picked up the tools, felt their weight, and put them down. They were looking, but Silas could tell they were not truly seeing. They saw individual items, a saw for $10, a plane for $30. They were nibbling at the edges, blind to the magnificent whole. Silas did not approach the bench directly. He started at the perimeter of the garage, his eyes taking in the details. The lumber rack, neatly stacked with boards of cherry, walnut, and curly maple, each piece marked with its species and the date it was acquired. The drill press in the corner, an old Walker Turner from the 1950s, a heavy cast iron beast that ran as true as the day it was made. The clamp rack, holding dozens of pipe clamps and bar clamps, each one clean and organized by length. This was not the shop of a tinkerer. This was the disciplined, curated space of a serious man, a man who, like Silas, believed that order in the shop led to order in the work. He moved slowly along the walls, his hands in his pockets. He saw the box of Japanese water stones for sharpening, a full set ranging from 800 to 8,000 grit. That set alone was worth $300. He saw a cabinet filled with finishing supplies, shellac flakes, tongue oil, wax, all meticulously labeled. He saw jigs and fixtures hanging from the walls, custom made for specific operations, each one a testament to a problem solved with ingenuity. Finally, he approached the bench. The other men made way for him, a subconscious parting of the waters for an elder. Silas's presence commanded a quiet respect. He looked older than his 72 years. His face is a roadmap of concentration, his hands thick and calloused, but with an underlying grace. He ran a single finger along the maple top of the bench. It was still dead flat. He saw the thumbtack and the index card. He read the looping cursive. Workbench and all tools, $400. Silas felt a sudden, cold stillness in his chest. It was not excitement. It was a profound sadness. He felt as if he were standing in a great library where all the books were being sold by the pound for pulp. The woman who wrote that price, the son who agreed to it, they had not just misjudged the monetary value. They had failed to recognize the value of a human life, of the 53 years of dedication and passion that stood embodied before them. They were selling a man's soul for the price of a used television. He stood there for a full minute, his face impassive. He looked at the Lie-Nielsen smoother, sitting in its cradle on the bench. Its bronze body glowed with a soft, warm light. He looked at the Marple's chisels in their roll, the handles dark with Arthur's own DNA. He looked at the record vise, its green paint chipped in a few places, a record of work done. He was not thinking about the bargain. He was not thinking about the incredible fortune that had fallen into his lap. He was thinking about Arthur Peterson. He was thinking that a man's legacy deserved more respect than this. He turned and saw a man in a polo shirt with a software company logo on it, talking to a customer. He was pointing to a lawnmower. Barely used it, the man was saying. 5 years old, but he only cut the front yard with it. $100 and it's yours. Silas knew this was the son. He had Arthur's jawline, but not his eyes. Arthur's eyes, the few times Silas had met them, were calm and knowing. The son's eyes were restless, constantly scanning, calculating. Silas waited until the lawnmower transaction was complete. He approached the son, who was stuffing the cash into his pocket. "Excuse me," Silas said. His voice was quiet but carried the gravel of age. Mark turned. "Yeah, can I help you?" "The workbench," Silas said, nodding toward the center of the garage. "Ah, yeah." "The whole shebang," Mark said, a salesman's smile appearing on his face. $400. You get the bench, all the tools on it, all the tools on the wall. Everything. We need it gone today. You'd need a truck, of course. Thing must weigh a ton. Silas looked at Mark. He considered for a moment telling him. He considered explaining what was here. He could have said, "Sir, your father was a master craftsman. This collection is the result of a lifetime of dedication. That vise alone is worth the asking price. You are making a terrible mistake." But he looked at the son's impatient eyes, at the way he checked his phone for messages while Silas was standing right there. And he knew it would be pointless. To explain the value would be like trying to explain the color blue to a man born blind. Mark did not have the vocabulary for this kind of worth. His world was one of quarterly earnings and billable hours, of assets and depreciation. These tools, to him, were a depreciated asset. Their value was zero. The $400 was a bonus. So Silas made a different choice. He would not educate the son. He would rescue the tools. He would become their custodian. It was the only act of respect he could pay to the memory of Arthur Peterson. He met the son's gaze. He said simply, "I'll take it." Mark's smile widened. "Great, fantastic. You got a truck?" "I do," Silas said. "It's down the street. It may take me a few trips." "No problem. No problem at all," Mark said, relieved. "Take all day if you need, just as long as it's gone by 5. We're closing up then." He gestured toward a card table where his sister was collecting money. "You can pay her over there." But Silas did not move. He reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. He withdrew a simple white bank envelope. From it, he pulled 4 crisp, new $100 bills. He had brought exactly $500 with him, his self-imposed limit for the day. He held the bills out to Mark. The son looked surprised, then pleased. It was easier this way. He took the money, his fingers brushing Silas's. Mark's hands were smooth. Silas's felt like old leather. All right then, Mark said, folding the bills and stuffing them into the same pocket that held the lawnmower money. It's all yours. I'll go put a sold sign on it. The transaction took less than 30 seconds. Mark found a piece of cardboard and a marker, wrote sold in big block letters, and propped it up against the bench. The crowd of hobbyists who had been circling the bench let out a collective, quiet groan. One of them, a man in a new-looking Duluth Trading Co. vest, approached Silas. You got one hell of a deal there, old-timer. The man said, his voice a mix of envy and admiration. I was just working up the nerve to pull the trigger myself. Silas just nodded. He didn't feel like he'd gotten a deal. He felt like he'd just paid ransom. The man continued. That big vise, that's a pattern maker's vise. You know what that's worth? I do, Silas said. And those bronze planes, another man chimed in, pointing. Those are Lie Nielsen's. That's top-of-the-line stuff. I know, Silas said again, his voice even. He ignored the growing buzz of conversation around him. He walked to his truck, a methodical calm settling over him. He backed it up the driveway, the old engine rumbling quietly. He opened the tailgate. He would start with the loose tools, the saws, the chisels, the planes. He would wrap each one in old blankets he kept behind the seat. He would treat them with the care they deserved. It took him nearly an hour to carefully pack and transport the hand tools alone. He created a bed of blankets in the truck, laying each plane on its side so the blade was protected. He rolled the chisels back into their leather wrap and placed them in a box. He handled each item with a quiet reverence, the way a librarian handles a rare book. While he worked, Mark was busy selling off the rest of his father's life. A fishing rod for $20, a set of golf clubs for $50, a collection of National Geographic magazines for $10. By 11 a.m., other serious woodworkers began to arrive. These were not the early bird hobbyists. These were men like Silas, members of the Society of the Quiet and the Skilled. They were drawn by the same words in the ad, full woodshop. A man named Tom, who ran a one-man shop in Geneva, walked into the garage, took one look at the sold sign on the bench, and immediately knew he had missed something important. He walked around the bench, his eyes cataloging the empty spaces on the wall, the ghosts of the tools that had hung there. He recognized the brand names on the few remaining boxes of fasteners and supplies. He saw the quality of the bench itself. He found Mark standing by the cash table. Who bought the bench? Tom asked. His tone was not accusatory, just curious. An old guy. Drove an old Ford pickup, Mark said, counting a small stack of bills. Silas Blackwood, Tom said. It was a statement, not a question. I didn't get his name, Mark replied, shrugging. Tom shook his head slowly, a small, sad smile on his face. You know what you just sold for $400, son? Mark's posture straightened slightly. He was a salesman, and he smelled a challenge. Yeah, my dad's old workbench. No, Tom said, his voice patient, as if explaining something to a child. You sold a Lie Nielsen tool collection. You sold a set of vintage Marples chisels. You sold a rare record pattern maker's vise. You sold about 1,000 board feet of kiln-dried, premium hardwood. And you sold the finest handmade workbench I've ever seen in this county. He paused, letting the words sink in. You sold a life's work. My guess, you sold about $15,000, maybe $20,000 worth of stuff for the price of a used riding mower. Mark's face went blank. The confident, easy smile of the salesman vanished. He looked from Tom to the workbench, then back to Tom. For the first time, he was seeing it not as a pile of junk to be disposed of, but as something else. He didn't understand the names Tom had listed, Lie Nielsen, Marples, Record, but he understood the number. $20,000. He looked around the garage. He saw Silas, back now for another load, carefully placing a stack of hand-sawn lumber into the bed of his truck. He saw the care with which the old man handled each board, as if it were precious. He watched as Silas coiled an extension cord with a practiced, perfect loop, a small act of order and discipline. The confident outsider, the man who knew the value of everything in his own world of software and servers, was suddenly adrift. He had been a tourist in his own father's life, and he had just sold the most valuable part of it without even recognizing it. The irony was crushing. The one thing he had dismissed as worthless was the only thing of real, lasting value his father had owned. Let me tell you what happened next. Silas made 4 trips in total. The last trip was for the bench itself. It was too heavy for one man, even a strong one, to move. Silas approached Tom and another woodworker he recognized, a man named Dave. He did not need to explain. "Could you give me a hand with this?" Silas asked. "It would be an honor," Tom said. The 3 old men, with a combined age of over 200 years, gathered around the bench. They grunted and strained, their joints creaking in protest. They lifted the massive maple top off its base and slid it into the bed of Silas's truck. Then they loaded the base. As they worked, Mark Peterson stood in the doorway of the garage, watching. He said nothing. The certainty had drained from his face, replaced by a look of confusion and a dawning, terrible regret. When the bench was loaded, Silas closed the tailgate. He walked over to Mark. The son braced himself, expecting a lecture, or perhaps a gloating remark. Silas simply looked at him. "Your father was a good man," he said. "He did good work." Mark could only nod, his throat tight. I I didn't know," he stammered. "I thought it was just stuff." Silas held his gaze for a long moment. It wasn't an unkind look, but it was searching. It was a look that measured the distance between a father and a son. "It wasn't stuff," Silas said quietly. "It was his language." Then he turned, got into his old truck, and drove away. The aftermath of that day spread slowly through the small community of woodworkers in Northeast Ohio. The story of Silas and Arthur Peterson's bench became a kind of legend, a cautionary tale about the difference between price and value. Mark Peterson sold the house 2 months later for $125,000. After paying off the mortgage and splitting the proceeds with his sister, he walked away with about $45,000. He never told her about the tools. He kept the $400 from the sale, the money Silas had paid him, in a separate envelope in his desk drawer for a year as a kind of penance. He would sometimes open it and look at the 4 bills, a tangible reminder of his own ignorance. Silas Blackwood did not sell a single tool. He took Arthur Peterson's legacy back to his own pole barn workshop and began a slow, methodical process of integration. He spent a full week just cleaning and restoring. He disassembled the record vise, just as Arthur had done 50 years before, cleaning the old grease and applying a new, clean coat. He sharpened every chisel, bringing the edges back to a state of gleaming perfection on his own waterstones. He took apart each hand plane, cleaning the metal bodies with mineral spirits, flattening the soles on a granite surface plate, and sharpening the blades until they could sever a human hair. As he worked, he felt a strange kinship with the man he had barely known. He could read Arthur's life in the tools. He saw where Arthur had modified a plane's tote to better fit his hand. He saw the small pencil marks on a saw handle, notations for a particular filing angle. He saw the care, the patience, the decades of quiet devotion. He was not just cleaning tools. He was communing with a fellow soul. He placed Arthur's bench against the back wall of his own shop. He did not use it as his primary bench. He had his own, a partner to his own life's work. But he kept Arthur's bench as a monument. It became his sharpening station and assembly table. Every time he stood at it, he thought of the man who had flattened its top by hand. Let me tell you about what survives. It isn't the money. It isn't the house. It's the knowledge, the skill, the standard. That is the only inheritance that matters. About a year after the sale, Silas took on a young apprentice, a boy of 20 named Ben, who was eager to learn the trade but had grown up in a world of disposable furniture and plastic tools. Silas started him not on the power tools, but at Arthur Peterson's bench. The first lesson was sharpening. Silas laid out Arthur's marbles, chisels, and his own sharpening stones. A woodworker is only as good as his edges, Silas told the boy. The first skill is not cutting wood, it's sharpening steel. Your father's father knew this. My father knew this. The man who owned these chisels knew this. Now you will know it. For a month, Ben did nothing but learn to sharpen. He learned to feel the burr on the edge of the steel, to hold a constant angle, to work his way through the grits of the stones until he could produce an edge that was flawless. He was learning a skill, but he was also learning patience. He was learning that excellence has no shortcuts. When Ben had mastered sharpening, Silas handed him the Lie-Nielsen number 4 smoother, Arthur's plane. This was a tool that belonged to a master, Silas said. He saved for a year to buy it. You will treat it with respect. You will learn to read the grain of the wood. You will learn to set the blade for a cut so fine you can see through the shaving. This plane will teach you more than I ever can if you listen to it. And so the legacy of Arthur Peterson, the quiet lineman who loved wood, was not lost. It was not sold for $400. It was transferred. It flowed from Arthur's hands, through the steel and bronze of his tools, into the hands of Silas Blackwood, and from Silas into the hands of a new generation. The price tag on the bench was a testament to a world that has forgotten how to value things you cannot plug in, a world that mistakes the packaging for the content. But value is a stubborn thing. It persists whether it is recognized or not. It waits patiently for a knowing eye, for a skilled hand. It waits for someone who speaks its language. The real value of that workbench was not in the thousands of dollars the tools were worth. It was in the accumulated wisdom they held. It was the physical embodiment of a set of principles: patience, precision, a relentless pursuit of quality, and a deep respect for the materials. These were the principles Arthur Peterson lived by. They were the principles Silas Blackwood recognized and honored. What is a legacy? It is not the money you leave behind. It is the standard you pass on. On a quiet Saturday in a garage in Ohio, a man's legacy was nearly sold for scrap. But a quiet expert, a man who understood the language of wood and steel, was there to catch it. He paid the price that was asked, but he knew the true value was incalculable. He didn't steal a bargain. He preserved a history. And in the end, that is what matters. Not what something costs, but what it is worth.